Good afternoon and welcome to this epic talk. My name is Will Alton and I'm providing technical support today. Just a quick reminder that you can turn on closed captions by clicking on the CC button. It should take a little while to warm up, but will provide text of people speaking. Now I'm going to hand straight over to Ariane Crampton.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Will, for the introduction. So my name is Ariane Crampton. I'm the head of carbon reduction here at Wiltshire Council, and I'm delighted to be facilitating this session today. This is our first online EPIC talk, and it's called Eco-Anxiety, COVID and Climate Psychology, and will be delivered by Caroline Hickman. We will be recording this session and publishing it online after the event. You can also stream the event afterwards using the link that you received for today. Our interaction with you, the audience, will be through your questions via the chat. So you'll be able to submit questions throughout the talk and we will moderate them and respond to them in the Q&A. We'll assume that if you submit a question with your name, you're happy for us to read out your name when we read it out. And we'll present the questions to Caroline when she's delivered her lecture. If you're on social media, please feel free to tweet any points from the talk using the hashtag #EpicTalks and mention @WiltsCouncil and @UndeniablyEpic. So I'd now like to introduce Terence Herbert, our Chief Executive here at Wiltshire Council, who will say a few words before we introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've been fortunate enough to introduce a number of speakers and a number of topics throughout this series of epic talks, and I must say that this is one that I've been most looking forward to hearing. It is, of course, incredibly topical and given the climate emergency, and I'm pleased to say that it's a climate emergency is something that we in Wiltshire Council have recognised. Now, Wiltshire faces two key challenges regarding climate change: reducing greenhouse gases that rapidly across the county, and we have stated an ambition to make Wiltshire carbon neutral by 2030, and that's going to require large-scale coordinated change across all sectors of the economy, homes and transport. The council itself has committed to being carbon neutral by 2030. Also improving our resilience to the likely changes in climate that we will face in Wiltshire. It's 20 odd degrees now, it's nearly October, and the changes in climate are hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, with the increased frequency of extreme weather and flooding. And I'm sure a number of you will remember some of the significant floods that we've had in the recent past. Now, the council has set up a new climate team who's going to develop a climate strategy. That's going to be led by Ariane, and that will set out our approach to tackle these challenges. And in order to do that, we're going to have to reduce emissions from transport, homes and non-residential buildings and infrastructure, encourage renewable energy generation in the county. I'm going to ensure that the county ensures its preparedness for extreme weather, such as through better flood defences and improved green and blue infrastructure. We're going to reduce waste, and we're going to lead by example in all that the council does, from procurement to staff policies to buildings and to transport. All of these actions will help to develop the green economy in Wiltshire and support a green recovery. So how are we going to achieve this? Well, we're going to need to engage with a wide range of stakeholders to encourage and support them to take action. We have started to do this already through our area boards, and we're taking part in a conference with the Wiltshire Climate Alliance to talk about the green recovery. This talk is about climate psychology, and it comes at absolutely the right time. So our speaker today, Caroline Hickman, is a psychotherapist who teaches at the University of Bath and is a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. for whom she's created several podcasts on eco-anxiety and psychotherapy, the climate and biodiversity crisis, and why some adults are reacting badly to youth climate strikers. She's currently researching children and young people's feelings about the climate and biodiversity crisis to uncover and explore different stories, narratives and images around our defences against the difficult truth of the climate and biodiversity crisis and hidden in this conscious feelings about climate anxiety. As a father of two teenagers who talk about climate and how anxious they feel about the future, I think this is an incredibly important talk for us to listen to. Caroline is passionate about getting under the surface of all of this. So that's enough talking from me. I'd like to give you a warm welcome to our speaker, Caroline Hickman.
Thank you, Terence. That's a lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. Now I need to screen share, I think. So hopefully everybody there can see the screen. I've got a series of slides to go through and a talk to give you. My plan is to talk for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then really try and move to answering your questions. I think it can be so much more interesting to deal with your direct questions. So please send your questions in. And please bear with me and don't sort of lose hope halfway through my talk, because and sort of go off and want to sort of lie in a dark room, because I am going to start with the difficult stuff. I'm going to start with the despairing, painful, difficult reality of what we have to face. And I am going to move us towards the more hopeful, optimistic things that we can be doing. So I'm not going to leave you in despair, I promise. So stick with me if you can. But it's really important that we start with that reality, isn't it? Because let's face it, the newspapers this week, we only have to look at, we've only reached Tuesday. Monday, The Guardian tells us that we failed to hit our biodiversity targets, which marks a lost decade for nature. The UK has failed to reach 17 out of 20 UN biodiversity targets agreed on 10 years ago. This has resulted in this lost decade for nature. I did warn you, we're starting with the difficult stuff. So that was yesterday, and today, front page of The Guardian. I don't work for The Guardian, but I just happened to read it. Front page, anxiety in the UK, cases have trebled in a decade. There's been an explosion in anxiety in Britain over the past decade, research shows, with the financial crash, austerity, Brexit, climate change, and social media blamed. We'll talk about that in a minute, for huge rises in the condition. Actually, no, let's talk about that now, because you know what? One of the main measures of mental health and sanity is our capacity to respond to the reality of the world that we see around us. So I personally would not be blaming social media for the rise in anxiety. I would say the rise in anxiety is a perfectly reasonable, rational, healthy, congruent response to the reality of the world that we're facing at the moment. So I'm not sure about that blame. We'll come back to that later on. Didn't like that word. So, you know, we had a YouGov survey earlier in 2020, where 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they were more worried about climate change than they were this time last year. And then, sorry, I did warn you, this is where we're starting. We've got this news from the Thwaites Glacier, which is melting. We've got the devastating fires in Australia earlier this year, currently in the US. We've got flooding. It's not nice out there. And we need to face that reality. So, but we have to keep in mind that a measure of mental health is being able to respond emotionally accurately to the reality of what's going on out there. But I need to introduce this guy. This is my co-researcher and resident therapy dog, Murphy, who, this is a younger version of him. He's currently snoring on the sofa at the moment. He's in the room. He's a sweet old 13-year-old Labradoodle. If I shut him in the kitchen, I'd just get the droopy ears all night, and he'd be wondering what he'd done wrong, and he might howl. So he's on the sofa. So you need to know, if you hear the sound of an old dog coughing in the background, it's Murph. Occasionally, I'm really sorry to say, he starts snoring mid-presentation. He has heard all this before. I'm hoping he's not commenting. And this is his character. So this was the one attempt that some friends and myself, when we were on Dartmoor a couple of years ago, attempted to shut the dogs in the yard so we could have a private talk. And, you know, he stuck his head through the cat flap, and being the sort of dog mother I am, I took a photograph before I got his head out of the cat flap. So that's Murphy. You may hear him in the background. He's a sweetie. So don't panic if you hear the sound of terrible coughing. So I'm going to talk about climate psychology. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and the anxiety. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. As I've said, we are going to come around to some of the more positive things we can do, but I'm not going to go down the, oh, we can fix this, oh, there's loads we can do route. What I'm going to be trying to talk to you about this afternoon and this evening is how we have to navigate that really difficult tension between hope and optimism and despair. Because both of those ends of that spectrum are, it's a false binary. We mustn't get naive hope. That would just be pointless, because the reality is things are getting worse. And it's already too late for some of the countries that we love and care about around the world. Some of my research is with children in the Maldives, in Bangladesh, in the Niger Delta. It's too late for a lot of those countries. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of having a local sensibility and engagement with this emotionally, but also to place that in a global context, because that impacts on us too. It's important that we feel alongside that too. This is a psychological presentation, so yes, of course, absolutely. We need policy responses, we need practical responses, we need technology, we need political responses, yeah? Of course, this is all important, so I'm not going to deny that. But that's not my field of expertise, so I'm going to be talking to you about the emotional stuff and about psychology and what psychology can bring to the table, really. So, the Climate Psychology Alliance has a motto, I guess, is what we call it, about facing difficult truths. And really that's what I'm communicating about here, is about facing difficult truths. A colleague in the Climate Psychology Alliance, Chris Robertson, recently was overheard saying, he thinks we should change that to why people lie about the climate and biodiversity crisis, because actually we're a bit beyond facing difficult truths. Now we've got to look at some of the misinformation and the disinformation about it, psychologically, socially, personally, and globally and collectively, because there's still a lot of misinformation out there. But that's the Climate Psychology Alliance. The website is open to the public. Go have a rummage around. There's lots of podcasts, lots of information. And we also provide therapeutic support. We offer 3 free sessions to people who are struggling with their feelings about the climate and biodiversity crisis. We have 70 therapists signed up to provide support to people. We're also providing workshops and training sessions and climate cafes to schools and to civil service and to GPs and to counselling organisations. So we're quite engaged in trying to raise public awareness and organisational awareness about the things that we can do emotionally around this issue. This is one of my favourite ever quotes. He's no longer the US advisor on climate change. He wouldn't be under the current administration. That's about as political as I will get. I'm going to tread a fine line, but you can read between the lines. But I really appreciate what he said here. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought within 30 years, good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. I've been working recently with a group of climate scientists, not just in the UK, but internationally. These are eminent scientists who've been involved in climate science research for decades. And what was significant, I'm only just going to say a little bit about the conversations I've been having with them. What was absolutely significant for me was that these men, they were all men, they're not all climate scientists are men, but this group are, older white men, powerful. You'd imagine them to be enormously powerful and to carry weight, carry gravitas in their field. And everything they were saying to me echoed what I hear young climate activists saying to me. Young people say to me they don't feel listened to, they don't feel respected, they feel that they're raising these concerns and people are dismissing how they feel. And you know what? This group of scientists were saying the same things to me, which I'm still trying to get my head around. What I'm going to do next, I think, is bring the two groups together, because I think the scientists and the young youth activists and climate strikers from schools would have a lot to share together. So apologies if this is offensive to anybody. I hope it's not meant to be. But one of the ways to engage with this emotionally and psychologically is scale and perspective, and a little bit of humour can be helpful. Because what we need to do is find ways to engage people thinking about this, where this is an incredibly difficult thing to think about. The scale is beyond anything we've ever engaged with before. People sort of try to equate the climate and biodiversity crisis with things like within reach, within our memory, or within certain people's memories of, say, for example, the Cuban Missiles Crisis, which was globally threatening. However, the Cuban Missiles Crisis was not on this scale. The Cuban Missiles Crisis, we could imagine ourselves beyond it. We could imagine that it would end. Okay, we could have apocalyptic, terrible fantasies around it, and it would have been devastating if there had been this nuclear war, of course. I'm not minimizing this. However, I'm trying to draw a differentiation between something like that, where we can imagine there being an end to it, and the climate and biodiversity crisis. We cannot imagine an end to the climate and biodiversity crisis, not today. We could have 50 years ago. Let me read you something. The peril, we live in perilous times. The peril is of our own making, and many of us probably deserve it. But the children and the native peoples of this world, and importantly, all the other species sashaying around in this great dance of life, do not deserve the peril that we have created. The ecologist Raymond Dasman says that World War III has already started, and it's the war of industrial humans against the earth. He's correct. All of us are warriors on one side or another in this war. There are no sidelines, there are no civilians. Ours is the last generation that will have the choice of wilderness, clean air, abundant wildlife, and expansive forests. The crisis is that severe. What is important is that you do something now. You need to act now. It's urgent. Now, this sounds like Greta Thunberg. This sounds like the messaging of Extinction Rebellion. This sounds like what we've been hearing in the last couple of years from climate activists. But that was written and published in 1991, and those ideas have been around since the 1960s. So in the 1960s, we had more time. In the 1970s, we had more time, etc. We don't have that time now. So apologies again. I hope this doesn't upset people. I need to bring us into feeling the scale of this, the severity of this, the enormity of this, with hopefully, please, hopefully without traumatizing you, without terrifying you, because we need to hold that tension. Above all else, right now, we need to, some people say we need to grow up. Chris Robertson in the Climate Psychology Alliance says we need to grow down. We need to, maybe it's a bit of both. We need to both grow up and step into this challenge fearlessly with courage. We also need to grow down into the complexity of these feelings and not look for naive, quick and easy solutions, because they're not going to be found, not today. So this puts it into scale of COVID. Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. A bit tongue in cheek with the looming recession, and I am not taking that lightly. That is devastating for us. But behind that, we also have climate change, and behind that, we have biodiversity collapse. Sorry, folks. I did warn you. Stick with me. Oh, we're not quite done. Yes, so here we have a woman asking a man, it's non-gendered joke. Can you give me a hand moving these? 1984, Handmaid's Tale, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, The Hunger Games, Planet of the Apes, from the fiction to the non-fiction section. Sorry. There is some method, if you like, in my slight madness of starting with this, which is that often people can't engage with the complexity of those feelings about this. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I can feel myself feeling really sad and upset and frustrated and stressed as I'm saying this, and I've said this many, many times before. This is my work. I work as a psychotherapist with children, with teenagers, with adults who are engaged in this stress, this dilemma, this crisis. It's my profession, and I'm not exempt from feeling humanly vulnerable and anxious and stressed about this. But my job is to try and find ways to communicate about this, to navigate, and to help form community. Because I am of the belief that talking about this, that connecting with each other, with sharing this reality, with finding ways, navigating our way through this together, is one of the few things that makes it okay. So paradoxically, it's kind of not okay, and it can be okay at the same time if we step into this and pull together. We've had a taste of that with the COVID crisis, with the way communities pulled together, with the way people supported each other, with the way people showed capacity to care, not just the absolute heroes and heroines in the NHS and taxi drivers and shopkeepers and community activists and council workers who kept things together for the rest of us. But ordinary, everyday people kind of had an opportunity to show they cared. So there is an idea here that actually underneath, we were feeling disconnected from each other a lot of the time. So maybe there is that opportunity within that crisis, within that tragedy, within that painful reality to reconnect and care. And so maybe there are some good things can come out of this. Paul Huggett from the Climate Psychology Alliance said, the reality is we're living in a time when a tragedy, which is without precedent, is unfolding in front of our eyes. We're witnessing catastrophic rates of species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil and ocean exhaustion, and runaway climate change. Now, one of the ways psychologically I think that we can use a tool, a practical tool, to help ourselves find ways to communicate and to talk about this amongst ourselves, and particularly with children and young people, is to think about this model of a climate change lens. So there's a psychological model of a trauma lens, where it's like putting a lens over the front of a camera to understand how people communicate when they've gone through trauma. And what it means is that that past trauma shapes the way we talk today, the way we relate today. It doesn't have to entirely dictate it, but it helps us understand where people are coming from. So I think we can have a similar idea about having a climate change lens, because a lot of people who are deeply anxious or traumatized about the climate and biodiversity crisis, it's as if you can't really think about anything else. It impacts on all aspects of your daily life, to the point at an extreme end where people are struggling to know, what can I buy, what can I eat, how can I navigate this? So I wanted to think about this on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we can feel quite traumatized and upset and anxious about this, and then put it to one side and still get on with our lives. The majority of people are down that end of the spectrum, but there are people at the far end of that spectrum, many of whom I work with, who are completely overwhelmed, who struggle to function today. Young people I work with who are self-harming and suicidal, partly because of their fear and anxiety about the climate emergency. But what they say very clearly to me is it's also because of what they feel is that failure of adults, people in charge, to act. And what they need is reassurance and containment from people, older adults, to say, yeah, okay, we haven't got all the solutions, but here's what we are doing about it. So that's one of the key messages to give to anybody who's in that particularly traumatized end of that spectrum. The philosopher Timothy Morton is quite interesting on this. He says that he thinks that we were traumatized about the climate and biodiversity crisis 40, 50 years ago. But this remained unconscious to the majority of people, not to climate activists or people working in the environmental movement or some people, but for the vast majority of us, we were not fully aware. So we just carried on thinking, oh, it'll get sorted out somewhere down the road, or, you know, the government will save us, or science will save us, or technology will save us. His argument is that we were traumatized 40, 50 years ago, but it's been unconscious. And what's happening is that now that trauma is coming to the surface. And he says that it's not so much that we're traumatized today, but that we're dealing with some of the impact of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the historical connection with actually some of this damage has been done 40, 50 years ago. And in some cases, it's too late to repair that. Now, I know I keep saying that, and I'm really sorry if that's incredibly painful to hear. I know it is. And I need to tell the truth. When I started my research a few years ago, particularly with children and young people, I was thinking, well, okay, it's really not good practice for a psychotherapist and researcher to terrify and traumatize children when she's going about her research. So I want to talk to children about how to do this research with them, how to talk to them about this incredibly frightening thing without completely terrifying and traumatizing them. So I asked them. So I asked a number of children, how do we do this? How do we talk about this? Which, by the way, is key, I think, to talking not just with children and young people, but anyone that you want to have that conversation with. First of all, ask them how to have the conversation with them. Don't just go straight in. Anyway, that's my story. So I asked a number of children, and I'm going to quote Sophia. I'm not only allowed to use her name, but she'll be quite cross with me if I don't use her name, because what she said was brilliant. She said, well, she said, you've got to tell me the truth, she said, about the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. By the way, she's 10. Let me just remind you of how wise this child is. She said, you've got to tell me the truth. She said, because if you don't tell me the truth, she said, you're lying to me. She said, and if you lie to me, she said, I can't trust you. She said, and if I can't trust you, then I can't talk to you about things that are scaring me. I love this child, right? She said, so, she said, tell me the truth. She said, but don't tell me all the scary stuff all at once. She said, tell me the truth, tell me the scary stuff. She said, and then tell me some good stuff, and then tell me some scary stuff, and then tell me some good stuff. She said, keep it in balance. She said, will that do? She said, can I go and watch television now? I said, yes, thanks. You've just given me my research framework, Sophia. Thank you. So back to what I'm talking about here. We have to be able to think about the climate crisis physically and psychologically and imaginally. We need to stretch ourselves. This is a real stretch of the imagination. We have to imagine ourselves forwards as well. It's unprecedented. It's an overused word, rather. We've had quite a few unprecedented things recently, haven't we? And it requires considerable adjustment. And we get triggered. What gets triggered when we start to talk about it and think about it is we can feel loss of control, anxiety, vulnerability, and uncertainty. And certain messengers and exploitative organizations and people will exploit that uncertainty and say things, for example, like, see, even the scientists don't know what's going on. I'm referencing someone from today. What that uncertainty does is it seeds doubt and anxiety, and it means that people stop trusting people who actually do know what's going on, and wise people who really need to give us a framework to navigate this. Because it is an existential threat, it's a social threat, it's a global threat, and it's a personal threat. And we need to examine both long and short-term impacts. And it's not experienced equally. It is a deeply unequal crisis that we're facing. It is worse if you're living in poverty, if you're living with poor air quality, if you're Black and minority ethnic communities, marginalised groups. We know about the impact of inequality on healthcare over generations. If you have a poor diet or compromised immune system, And then we know the stress between urban versus rural populations. So the climate, biodiversity crisis, coronavirus, massively unprecedented, and we have to find ways to engage with this emotionally if we're going to find a way through it. There's been a lot of messaging about let's get back to normal, but you know what? We don't actually know what normal means, because the old normal, I'm sorry, has gone. We've got how many new normals now? Multiple new normals developing daily almost. What that signals, so we need to kind of look under the surface of that and try and understand what's meant by that messaging. It signals a need to get back in control. But we have to be careful that that's not a naive hope that risks us denying the significance of the change. So again, we've got to hold that tension. This narrative of the new normal and the need to adjust to long-term change. So what's needed there is both and. Some things have to be changed long-term, such as our relationship with agriculture, our relationship with biodiversity, because that's why we're dealing with coronavirus in the first place. We don't want that back. That was an old normal. So we need to learn from some of this, develop some new normals, if you like, but we also need some long-term adjustment. But we need both and solutions rather than either or solutions. So we need to both make these changes and reclaim and build back in some of the good things, the genuinely good things that we have about our communities. But it's incredibly difficult for us as human beings to deal with long-term uncertainty. We kick it into the long grass. If it's not affecting me today, then I'll worry about it later. We cannot afford to continue functioning that way, either about the coronavirus or about the climate and biodiversity crisis. And to do that, we need emotional resilience. We need to come to terms with our insecurity and our vulnerability. And this is really hard, because we get this kind of heroic narrative of we can fight this and we will find a way. Well, yeah, okay, we need some of that, but we don't just need a heroic narrative. We also need a more reflective narrative that says, you know what, sometimes we don't know what we're doing, but we're doing our best. Sometimes we're going to have to find our way through this. We need to be more reflective, and we need to build space into that for grief and loss and sadness and confusion and the realities of what it means to be human. Because if nothing else, this coronavirus, the climate and biodiversity crisis, is making us face our humanity. And there's something good to be gained out of that. That brings emotional depth, that brings wisdom, and that's something to be gained. Otherwise, we will just be functioning through these threats of fight, fright, freeze, and flop. And we'll just go, oh, we can fix it, or, oh, it's not really happening, or, I don't know what to do, or, oh, it's all terrible. Those are all the defenses that get kicked off. We need to hold the tension so we don't collapse into those defenses, because it's tough, and we can find a way through it. Why climate psychology? So, you know, yes, we need the technological, we need the practical solutions. But the reality is we're being forced down paths that have never been traveled before. We've got no blueprint. So we've got no way of navigating a lot of these things. And those are all rational solutions: political, policy development, science, technology. This is very rational. We like to think we're rational creatures. We'll come to that again in a minute. We are delusional if we think those rational solutions are enough on their own. They've not been acted on for decades. We've had the solutions for decades to the climate crisis. We've not acted. So why not? Psychology has to come in to help us ask that difficult question. We defend against things that are unbearable or too big for us to comprehend. How do we respond emotionally? What does this feel like? Well, eco-anxiety, we've touched on that. You could talk about that as eco-trauma. You could talk about that as loss and grief. The really important thing is it's not just anxiety. Anxiety is often the gateway. And I'm always relieved for anything that opens up doorways and gateways to people talking about feelings. So as far as I'm concerned, talking about eco-anxiety is great, but don't stop there. It also opens the door to talking about feelings of loss and grief, hope and hopelessness, anger and blame, frustration, guilt, fantasies of rescue, apocalyptic fantasies, avoidance, nihilism, despair. So yes, of course, we've got all these defenses running. Of course we have, inevitably as a result of this. The key message I'm giving you here is all of those feelings have their place in this process. Do not fall into the trap of labeling some of these as bad and some of these as good. That's a dangerous trap to fall into, to say, oh, hope is good and hopelessness is bad. No, absolutely not. Hopelessness is invaluable to us, because without connecting with our hopelessness, how on earth could we develop empathy for other people who might be feeling hopeless? If you listen to the narratives of a lot of the youth climate strikers, they all talk about having periods of hopelessness and collapse and despair before they find a way through that and get back up on their feet. And that's how we build emotional resilience. You cannot build resilience emotionally unless you've got an understanding of what it feels like to feel hopeless. Hopelessness also connects me empathetically with people globally who are facing situations where there is very little hope. So I would not want that taken away from me. So all of these emotional responses make sense. They're all congruent. They're all real. And I would worry about people that weren't having a mixture of these feelings, because your defenses are running and they're protecting you. But we need to start to find ways urgently now of reducing that defensive response in people so that we can mobilize to collective action urgently. So that's the message. The key message here is all of these feelings make sense. They all have their place. And actually, none of them are good and none of them are bad. They all carry meaning. So instead of labeling them as good and bad, let's talk about what it means. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a kind of neat way of starting to think about how we can get sort of moved around some of these issues. And you can see that physiological needs at the bottom there need to be met first. So when we're under crisis, we're under pressure, we stop thinking. When our safety and security, it gets knocked out by meeting those physiological needs first. I'm going to speed up a wee bit, otherwise we're going to be here till tomorrow. I just wanted to show you what happens under trauma. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, I hope that's the same for you, then survival, when our survival needs get big, our cognition gets really small. So when we're faced with how are we going to survive, we stop thinking. Hence, panic buying of toilet roll. Yeah? So we can't think when we're in survival mode. So the crucial thing is to reconnect, not just emotionally, psychologically, but keep our thinking in functioning for us. Because we're not completely rational creatures, I think I've said this before, we need to start to face these painful truths, and we need transformation, not just change. This isn't as simple as change. This is transformative. And this kind of figure really helps show some of that process of those feelings and what we might be going through. So you can see the anxiety and you can see the relief as you start to think, okay, we can invest in technology. Okay, we can go on climate strikes. Okay, we can have policy development. Yes, we're going to do this. You can see the relief, and you can see the denial, which is a kind of shortcut out, which keeps you trapped. But you can also see what people are trying to avoid, which we are trying to avoid. I shouldn't say people, we try to avoid, me too, me included. We try to avoid fear, threat, guilt, and depression. Depression is one of the feelings that we try to avoid the most in the world, because we're terrified of being trapped in depression. It's really overwhelming, it can be disabling, and we don't know how to function within that. One of the messages I'm giving you here this evening is depression can be your friend here, because by connecting with that feeling of sadness and loss and depression and moving through that to grief, it moves us to an acceptance, not a passive acceptance of, oh, well, we'll just have to put up with this, but a sort of active acceptance, an empowered acceptance of, right, let's get on with this, let's find solutions. But you're taking your depression and your capacity to connect with those feelings of loss and sadness with you. And that's what gives you emotional resilience. People talk about how to build emotional resilience. Somebody asked me this a while back, a friend who's in her early 20s, and she said, how do you build emotional resilience and wisdom? And I said, fail, make a mess of things, get things wrong, take the wrong turning in life. You know, think that you can make a complete mess of something and fail again. and keep getting back up and keep finding a way through it and then fail again. That's how you build resilience. That's how we find wisdom. And the joy of this, as you can see on the far right-hand side with the moving forwards, is that the emotional functioning, and I'm making this fairly simplistic, but the emotional functioning is at a higher level than when you went in. So that's what's to be gained from that uncomfortable journey. It has meaning, and there's a lot to be gained from it. So back to this psychology, we've talked about the defenses, denial, blame, splitting, projection, and it's uncomfortable. We've talked about reframing our relationship with depression. We need to think about our destructiveness, our inherent destructiveness. My argument is this no longer needs to be the work of psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. We all need to be doing this, right? I think this is absolutely what we need to be doing. And that's partly what we're trying to do through the Climate Psychology Alliance, is bring this out through climate cafes and conversations in the community so that we're all developing these psychological skills and tools. We need to build this resilience in ourselves and young people, face our resistance to change, confront our apathy, deal with the fact that we wish this would just go away, and deal with our attachment issues. Because we're 5% rational, conscious, functioning creatures. This is the model I'm giving you. And there's a lot going on under the surface. There's a lot driving us unconsciously, plus the collective unconscious, which connects us with people globally who are suffering. So that sense of suffering and the anxiety and the defense against that, I think there is comfort in connecting not just within ourselves and our local communities, but globally. We need global solutions to this. We cannot, and I'm sure that none of you would be sitting out there thinking this, but we can't just make it okay for ourselves in the UK and think, oh, well, I'm just really glad I don't live in Bangladesh. That's not okay, is it? What are we going to do? Put gunboats in the Thames? How are we going to manage? We're going to have massive migration because of climate and biodiversity crisis as things get worse. We need to start to deal with those really difficult things now. And we need maturity and wisdom and compassion and kindness. And we need to face the reality of what we've created, because this has been created by Western carbon emissions. So we need to get under the surface. We need to get in touch with that emotional impact under the surface and understand and contain this anxiety through empathy. And crucially, we need to be able to communicate back to people that we understand if they feel anxious and upset, or if they're defensive. So I would often say to people, I can understand that you feel defensive. I can understand that you're scared. Me too. Right. What can we do to talk about this together? I've got to speed up. Otherwise, we're in trouble. And there's just a bit of stuff about defenses. I'll make these slides available so you can have these. But here's some of our favorite defenses where we act things out and go into wishful thinking. You know, the technology will save us. You know, one of my favorite groups genuinely believes, and this is opposite really for Wiltshire with crop circles, genuinely believes that aliens will descend to the planet and save us just before it all becomes impossible. Now, you could say that these people are just, you know, a sandwich short of a picnic, or that's a technological, you know, professional term, of course. Or you could say, actually, you know what, this is just wishful thinking. Maybe that's not that difficult to thinking the government will save us or that other people will save us. Maybe we've got to listen to that as a defense and think, you know what, we've got to save us. And we've got to work in partnership with our local council. We've got to work in partnership with schools, with universities, with organisations, with our communities, yes. And we need to hope for change, but we have to be part of that change and not wait for someone to rescue us. There are mature defences. These are helpful. You don't have to be kind of noble all the time. You can have some courage, some emotional self-regulation, forgiveness, gratitude, humility, humour. It's okay to take a night off and watch reruns with friends and have a glass of wine on the sofa. You don't have to be kind of mindful all the time. Right? But we need to show respect. We need to have tolerance. We need to talk to ourselves as well as to each other. Because this is key. Our core human needs are to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. And then we feel we're not alone. And it's that isolation and feeling of aloneness which makes people defensive. That we can all do something about. So I want to talk very briefly about why adults might be struggling to hear what young people say about climate change. Not all adults, not all of us, absolutely not. But we do know from some of the press reports how some of the actions from youth climate strikers has been very negatively reported. And young people themselves are feeling very anxious and stressed, not just about the crisis, but about the way that adults sometimes perceive them. And it's partly because they're really presenting this message on behalf of other species, because they have this powerful, I'm generalizing, forgive me, but a lot of the children and young people have this undefended, strong, empathetic connection with the natural world, with the environment, which we're part of too. So this is what young people have been telling me through therapy and through my research, that they've got this attachment to planet and to nature, that they're angry, clear-sighted, determined. They care about future generations. 10-year-olds talking about fears for their children and their children's children. There's a wisdom in that. They're very good at listening to each other with empathy. I think in many ways, children and young people often embody the vulnerability that a lot of adults struggle to own up to, that we want to be strong and we want to keep it together. So children will often embody that vulnerability for us. Apologies again, I know I'm generalizing. They are less likely to other nature and see nature as something to exploit. They are much more likely to say, it's not fair what we're doing to nature. So maybe they're embodying the distress of the planet for us. Maybe we should listen to that wisdom. They say they need adults to tell the truth and be brave, and they want a different normal. Other young people say that taking a holiday or a break induces terrible guilt and shame. Some of them have suicidal feelings, self-hatred and self-harm. This is the extreme end. And there you would want some professional support, some professional help. Eating disorders. So I know young people who have gone into extreme veganism. Nothing wrong with veganism. But when it gets to extreme food restriction, then they're putting themselves at risk psychologically. I know many young people who struggle to speak with their parents. I think this is heartbreaking. They're feeling misunderstood. They feel despair. That we can do something about. They've lost friends because friends don't seem to care. Some young people say it's pointless going to school or college or university. Some people are choosing not to have children. These are individual choices. We should support them in talking through those choices. Sometimes activism really helps, and I'm not ever knocking activism. But it can lead to bouncing between hope and hopelessness. Activism is not the cure for eco-anxiety, not that eco-anxiety needs to be cured, because eco-anxiety is not a mental illness, it's a really healthy response. Activism is great, it's crucial, it gives you that sense of power and potency that you're doing something, but it's not enough on its own. You need that connection, that relational approach, and some of that is psychological. Some young people won't get in the car, won't travel. This lack of agency needs to be addressed by all of us. Here's what some parents have been telling me, that they can often struggle with feeling guilty and ashamed. They want to say sorry to children and young people, and I would say it's really valuable to say sorry to children and young people. And I often say, listen, we've made mistakes. I'm sorry we've messed this up for you. We as adults really need to take responsibility for that. Now, I'm not collapsing into blame and self-pity and guilt and saying I'm a terrible human being, but I am owning my culpability. We are responsible. We need to stand in that and say sorry. And children need to see adults saying that and not collapsing and not falling apart or trying to make us feel better. And then we say sorry, and then we say, right, now what can we do? How can we work together to sort this out? It's really painful to listen to children's pain, so I have great sympathy, but we need to find a way to do that. Of course we want to protect children. We want children to have a childhood free from these painful things, but maybe there's a different way to protect children now, which is to not hide this stuff away from them, but to talk to them. Because in a few years' time, they're going to turn around to you and say, why didn't you tell me? We need to start preparing children for some of this now. Distress in young people is far worse if parents don't stand alongside them and don't start to find ways to talk about them. Adults shouldn't minimise or patronise, because that will be often felt and interpreted as lying. But parents need support. They need to face their own feelings first. And we've been running support groups for parents through the CPA. And these parents are fabulous at supporting each other, find ways to talk with family and friends and their own children. We need relational solutions. We need to tell the truth, but we need to make it bearable. Otherwise, children are often reporting feeling betrayed and abandoned by adults. We need to consciously support young people for the world they're inheriting now. Because this concern, this connection with the environment and climate change is influenced by the degree to which we feel ourselves to be part of the natural world. You might be out there thinking, when is she going to get to the nice stuff? I'll get there, I promise, nearly there. It's really important. In Western cultural models, we often see ourselves as separate, egocentric, and nature is something over there. We need to reconnect with nature. Cultures, of course, and individuals and communities vary, but this is central. And this is part of the reason we're in this mess in the first place, because this modern construct of progress has embodied this idea of separating ourselves and dominating and conquering nature, physically and psychologically. Well, we're kind of learning about that with the COVID virus, aren't we? Here's a letter from a newspaper that shows how we can just get so disconnected here. My 6-year-old daughter's school recently announced a day trip to Southsea Beach to experience the seaside first time. But this letter informed parents that for safety and in line with local council policy, the children would not be allowed on the beach. Yeah, there's something seriously wrong, right? So, encounters with nature, with the natural world, and we saw so much about this through the COVID virus, can re-establish and reaffirm a sense of connection to the other, with ourselves, with our community. It makes us feel good. You can argue that this reconnection is essential if we're going to find sustainable solutions to climate change. And there's a crucial word there about the sustainability of solutions to the climate crisis. This requires a shift of consciousness. This is a paradigm shift. And that's why I say it's not just change. Nope, because it's their planet too. So I'm going to talk a little bit, back to the scary stuff, about the mass extinctions. This guy is the Bramble Key Melame. And I don't give a talk without showing him now, because he is the first mammal to go extinct because of human-caused climate change. Now, you might say, well, it's okay, I'm pretty sure you won't be, I hope. But we could survive without him. Well, sure we can, yeah? But he's the tip of the iceberg. He's the first mammal to go extinct. We've lost birds, we've lost, fish. He's a mammal. We're mammals. And it's because he lived here, and it's been inundated with salt water. So this means, this is another way of saying what I've just been talking about, this, we cannot go back to this kind of Edenic past of everything used to be fabulous, or nor can we have this idea of everything in the future can be fabulous either. We've got to hold that tension between these two, and then we do have a real fighting chance to have a creative, innovative, imaginal, community-oriented new future. But we must remember that we are mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations. We are part of this planetary crisis, and if we separate ourselves from it, we will just get ourselves into deeper trouble. So I want to show you a research project I did in Wiltshire with children, engaging them with nature and climate change. And we did it through talking about whales, W-H-A-L-E-S, by telling stories. And this is also based on the work of a friend of mine, who is another Wiltshire resident, Sonia, amazing artist, Sonia Schmaltz-Day, who one day picked up a stick on a beach and started drawing. And this is what she draws. She draws life-sized whales. Amazing, huh? So we worked with Cologne Infant Primary School to talk to children about whales, and we got them drawing whales. And we collected our data through whale drawings. And we measured whales. and we got them colouring in whales, because I was trying to be relational. How do we talk with 5, 6, 7-year-olds about climate change and not completely overwhelm them? Well, key to this is talk to them about the impact of climate change on whales, because everybody likes talking about whales. And we talked about warmer oceans and melting sea ice and sea level rises and the impact of climate change on whales. So I was asked questions like, how much does this is the joy of working with children, how much urine does a baby humpback whale pee on a daily basis? So I had to go away, look that up, come back and say, it's a bathful, because they drink a bathful of milk every day. So it's the equivalent, comes out the other end. So we then, organic chalk, spray painted a baby humpback whale on the school playing field. And we got more drawings, and you might be noticing those drawings are changing. And we planted it with 2.5 crocus bulbs, 1,000 crocus bulbs, which then grew. So this is the Wiltshire crocus whale. We grew a whale on their school playing field. We were very happy when those crocus bulbs came up. We weren't 100% sure they were going to, but they did. And Sonia's drawings, of course, disappear when the tide comes in. So that gave us an opportunity to talk to children about extinction and about vulnerability and about impermanence and things not being around forever. And of course, the crocus bulbs disappeared. Did it work? Well, the children said, we've got to put a sign up to stop people walking across the grass. They put chairs around where the whale would be before it even flowered. They stopped their parents walking across it. They changed their drawings. They included themselves in the drawings. And they understood about the symbolism and the vulnerability of the whales and how that connected to us as humans. One child said, the vulnerability of such a cavernous creature can be very unsuspected. When we usually think of unharmful animals, the first thing that hatches into our minds are tiny animals. We never identify that one of the largest mammals ever can be so undestructive and harmless. I think it was so cleverly thought of that we planted bulbs to represent the whale. I personally think the bulbs indicate a metaphor for how fragile the whale is, how fragile the bulbs are, and how fragile we are. So, solutions. We need to face our denial. We need a global empathy. We need to come to terms with our irrationality. We need to get under the surface of our feelings, make a place for feelings in technical solutions. The University of Bath now has me teaching climate psychology, pretty much what I've been talking about tonight, to engineering students, because they want emotionally intelligent engineers for the future. We need to confront our narcissistic entitlement. We can't have everything we want. We need to frame things as what do we need versus what do we want. We might want to eat meat, we might want to fly, but do we need to? Do we need to weekly? Do we need to daily? Do we need to do it as much as we've been doing? We need to grieve what we've done and lost. We need to understand and confront our apathy in a realistic way. We need to give up our old ways of living. And that doesn't mean new ways of living might not be more connected and fabulous. And we need to understand and examine and take responsibility for and repair our relationship with the natural world. We need to strengthen this ecological connection. We need to use the experience of trauma to help us find a way through this. We need to quit denial in the face of the facts, build this emotional intelligence, and empathetically connect with people's pain. I've started to reframe eco-anxiety as eco-empathy and eco-compassion and eco-caring, because you only feel anxiety and distress if you care, if you have empathy. So it's a good thing, really. Because we want wisdom. Excuse me, I was kind of hoping I'd get to the end before that. I'm going to have to stop in a sec, my voice is going to go. We're talking about wisdom, not just feelings, not just rationality, but intuition, a mix of rationality and emotion. Because Barack Obama, on June 25th, 2013, making his climate action plan, argued our children in the future would look back at us and ask if we did all that we could have done to deal with this problem? Or did we avoid doing what needed to be done? It's a very non-shaming way of framing it, I think, which is really helpful. So it's not about doing everything tomorrow. Yeah, we're not superhuman. But this language, did we do all that we could have done? Says, do more. And don't avoid it. And back to the grow up or grow down argument. And psychologically, traditionally, a lot of psychology cut itself off from studying nature. And James Hillman said, how could a human soul be so divorced from the spirit of its surrounding? Psychology dedicated to awakening the human consciousness needs to wake itself up to one of the most ancient human truths. We cannot be studied or cured separate from the planet. Because the truth is, to live fully in the world, which is a great thing to do, means to also feel the anxiety that goes with the territory of being a vulnerable human being. That's it.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. You covered a huge amount of ground. And as you'd expect, we have quite a few questions that have come in.
Fire away.
So I will ask you.
I will do my best, but no promises.
Okay. So we have a question which has been asked by a couple of people. So yep. Jilly and someone asked a similar question anonymously, which is on the topic of climate change deniers. And someone says, the anonymous person said, I've long ago realised you can't argue science with a climate denier. No. But if that position is actually an emotional response, then how best do we approach a rational discussion with them and what will work?
Okay, brilliant question. To be honest, I think there's actually very few genuine climate denialists left in the world today. And that's not to say that people may not present a denialist perspective and it is purely a defense. You're absolutely right. Facts and figures don't change people. And you're just going to get into a kind of argument about facts and figures and it'll exhaust you. So don't even attempt that. My first response to somebody who says, you know, it's not that bad and it'll change all by itself, or, you know, the scientists have got it wrong, or we always face this level of change. That level of denial is, I fully understand that you're really scared to talk about this. I would just be saying, I would be naming the fear that's causing that defense now. And I would be quite challenging on that today. I'd have been a bit gentler 5-10 years ago. Today I say, yeah, climate denial is understandable because it's really scary, isn't it? Let's talk when you feel ready to. Yeah. So I would just be naming it and leaving people with it and saying, yeah, it's scary. I'm scared too. And denial is not going to save us. But if you need to continue to deny, to save yourself, to protect yourself, you carry on. It's okay. I understand. Be empathetic, be compassionate, but challenge it and confront it. It's that kind of ruthless compassion, and name it. If somebody is aggressive with that, walk away. You know, don't try and convince somebody. Find people to talk to that want to talk to you. Don't exhaust yourself trying to convince people, because in a few years' time, the facts that are happening on our own doorstep will convince them. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, so another question from Annie Fiducia. She says, what do you think is the greatest barrier to young people taking environmental action?
The greatest barrier to young people taking action? Wow. Not sure about greatest barrier, but I'll just name off the top of my head a number of barriers. The first one that came to my mind was adults' attitudes.
Yeah.
So if adults are not stepping up, being culpable, taking responsibility and showing young people the way, then why should we expect young people to take action on this? So a great barrier is adult attitudes, either because adults themselves are in denial, or rather than denial, there's more of a disavowal around now, which is a different defense, which, you know, is actually trickier to deal with. Because disavowal is somebody who says, oh yeah, it's really worrying, isn't it? And it's really frightening, but yeah, we must do something. But where are you going on holiday this year? Right? So it's like with one part of your mind, you kind of go, yeah, it's scary. And with another part, you go, yeah, but la, 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 you know, somebody else will deal with this. That is more complex. That disavowal minimizes the severity and scale. So young people kind of get caught up in that disavowal because they will move back to what impacts them the most today, which is who's in love with who, how to survive at school, where you're going to go to university, how to get a job, how to cope with arguments with parents. They will inevitably keep coming back to that unless we put it on the table as adults. So I think an enormous barrier is giving young people permission, showing them the way and saying, you know, parenting, I need to show you how to do this now. And that's good parenting. So it's about not shaming young people if they do want to do the school strikes. Get out there and support them in getting their voices heard and making space at home to talk about scary things. Because young people will often feel that they can't talk about these things because parents haven't told them they can. Years ago, I went to do a research interview with a 10-year-old, and when I arrived, his dad said, and you know, his dad had a great relationship with him, and his dad said, oh, I don't know if he knows much about the climate emergency. I don't know how much you're going to get from him. I said, yeah, okay, we'll see. So I encouraged the dad to sit around and listen in, and it was Christmas, and the dad sat over the other side of the room by the Christmas tree, and I started talking to the child about the climate crisis and how he felt about it. And I got the child to personify climate change as an animal and then give it a voice. This is how I talk to young children without terrifying them. And within seconds, this 10-year-old was saying, oh, the climate emergency is a crocodile and it's crawling across the face of the earth, but it's the size of a continent. And it's eating and it's eating and it's consuming and it won't stop eating, but it's rotting from the inside out. And the scales are falling off, but it won't stop eating and it'll never, ever be satisfied. Amazing metaphor for climate crisis. And the father's face over the other side of the room was a picture. And what the dad said to me afterwards was, I didn't think he knew anything about it, but you know what? What I've realized is I never talked to him about it. So how would I know what he felt about it? So from that day on, they started talking about it regularly. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers. I think another big barrier is that we should not in any ways think children need to fix this for us. We need to hear their voices as part of the solutions. We need to make them part of that conversation. We need to give them the power to be heard and to take seriously what they're saying, not in a patronizing way. But, you know, a lot of young people are saying to me that they're really scared of getting labeled. They're really scared of the really nasty press attention that Greta Thunberg and the other youth climate strikers get. So, you know, we have a responsibility there, I think, to get in between youth climate strikers and young people and critics who are attacking them and say, stop it, because it's abusive. We need to make space for these young people to have their voices heard. So I think that's another enormous barrier that we can do something about. That's our responsibility.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. So I think we've got time for one more question. There's been quite a lot of appreciative comments. People have said it's a brilliant presentation, fascinating, thank you. So lots of appreciation there. There have been quite a lot of questions coming in, but I think I want to finish with this one. We're not going to have time to answer all of them, unfortunately, but thank you for submitting them. So a question from Poppy. She says, why do you think eco-anxiety has increased so dramatically in recent years? Does it coincide with a rise in general anxiety? And why is it affecting young people so much?
Okay, another brilliant question. Just on that, on the questions, if you save them and send them me, I won't do it tomorrow, but I will have a go at answering those questions and then send them back to Wiltshire, and Wiltshire can put them on the website. So rather than have those questions not answered, if you send them through to me, I will give it a go, but it won't be this week. But I would definitely like to respond to all those questions. Well, I think eco-anxiety has not so much increased. What's increased is it's come into conscious awareness. I think it's been there for decades, under the surface. And what's happened is it's massively come into public consciousness. As we've seen the reality in the world worsen, as we see the fires, we see the floods, we see the damage that's being inflicted. So following the IPCC report a few years ago and the biodiversity report, following the Paris Agreement of 2015, all of those things moved it massively into public consciousness. So what that did was it opened the doorway, it opened the gate for people to feel the anxiety. But I don't think it caused the anxiety, and I would be really, really clear about this. I think the anxiety was lurking underneath all along, and what's happened is it's come into conscious awareness. So now it's not appeared. So when people say that youth climate strikers are making children feel anxious, oh, that makes me crazy. It's the absolute opposite. What they're doing is giving voice to the anxiety that young people have been feeling for a very long time. I've been talking to children and young people about climate crisis for the past 5 years. So that precedes Greta Thunberg and the youth climate strikes. And so, you know, young people have been saying to me, let me just give you a couple of quotes. I think this is important. Young people have said to me, this was 5 years ago, climate change is happening as revenge on adults. You've messed up the planet for children. Climate change is happening to change things, to rebalance something that was out of balance, right? Children said, you know, children in the Maldives said, you know, people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier. They said, that's really lovely. They said, but we're going to be underwater soon. Who's going to have a funeral for us? Children are feeling this grief. They're feeling this loss. They're feeling this fear under the surface anyway. Nobody's causing it. It hasn't really increased. What's happened is it's come into public consciousness more and more and more. We shouldn't think of it as increasing. We should think of it as something that we're now all starting to be much more aware of. And that can only be a good thing, because unless we're aware of it, unless we can tolerate it, unless we can be compassionate towards it, we won't act on it. So those feelings will give us the impetus to act. Nothing else will.
Thank you, Caroline. That feels like a good place to end. That's been an absolutely fascinating talk. Really, really enjoyed it. We have taken all the questions that have come in through the Q&A, and thank you very much for the offer of answering those in writing. We will do that. I think we're probably able to publish that at the same time as we publish the recording of the event. Or maybe we'll publish the recording of the event, and then when we have the answers to the Q&A, we'll add that onto the website. Yeah, my colleagues are confirming that. So we plan to organise another one of these epic talks for November. So you receive that in due course. You'll get an invite to that. And I just want to say thank you, huge thank you to Caroline, to the audience for interacting so well, and for attending today's talk. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of the talk. I'd like to echo a thanks to Caroline Hickman for giving us her time and for answering the questions, and for the kind offer for answering any additional questions that you have. So please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A chat now, and I'll make sure they get forwarded on. Also, this is the first time we've used Teams live events to deliver an epic talk online. So if you've got any feedback you'd like to give us about what we might want to do in the future and how we might improve it, then please do so too. But thanks very much. Bye bye all.
Thank you, Will. That was great.